Welcome to Excellence Foresight, the podcast where we explore what excellence really looks like when organizations are tested, not when conditions are comfortable. We often talk about excellence through frameworks, matrices, and maturity models. But lived experience tells us something else. Excellence is not proven in stable conditions. It's revealed under pressure, when decisions carry real consequences, when time is short, and when the system shows us what it actually values. Today, I'm joined by Gerard Murphy, whose work spans safeguarding, crisis leadership, and international security environments. Contexts where failure is not theoretical and where organizational behavior becomes very visible very quickly. Gerard, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So let me start with our first question for you here today, Jerry. When excellence frameworks are tested under real pressure during transformation, crisis, or international security operations, what do you see that distinguishes organizations that appear mature from those that are genuinely mature?
Thanks, Nancy. And I suppose my background in policing over the last 33 years has helped me to understand what maturity reveals. So what I've constantly seen is that genuinely mature organizations become clearer under pressure, not more complicated. The level of maturity can also be seen within organizations and sections and departments. So it's not just the organization itself, but within the organization. And there is a discipline in how they think and act. People understand priorities, accountability is well understood, and leaders remain open to hearing what is actually happening, even when that information is uncomfortable. In mature organizations, I've seen, Nancy, information, especially uncomfortable or inconvenient information, moves quickly, relatively unaltered. Frontline realities reach decision makers without being softened, delayed, or reshaped to fit expectations. That means leaders are working with the live truth, what is actually happening, not what people think they want to hear. And as a result, decisions are more grounded, more risks are identified earlier, and corrective action happens in time. Where in contrast to that, in the less mature organization, that flow begins to degrade. Information gets delayed, diluted, or filtered as it moves upwards, and people may consciously or in some cases unconsciously reshape messages to avoid blame, protect reputations, or align with perceived narratives. Over time, this creates a subtle but critical shift, and leadership is no longer responding to reality itself, but to a constructed version of reality. And I suppose, in essence, what I'm saying is mature organizations become clearer under pressure and others become more guarded. And the real test is whether truth continues to move when pressure rises.
I think this is a great angle, Jared, and you've mentioned leadership many times, and I like the fact that you mentioned think and act, right? So we have our mindset, but the way we act, the way we behave is really something that reflects that. So what is the leadership behavior you think is very important or different in mature organization than others? One or two behaviors you would like to highlight?
For me, candor is something that is really important, and to be clear. And that's probably one of the first things that typically gives way in a less mature organization. So both leadership within the organization and leaders within the organization. So candor for me is one of the key pieces. Um, and the activity, while activity will increase, the clarity will decline in less mature organizations.
I think this doesn't surprise me coming from you, Jared, knowing you, also knowing how your leadership style. So candor, I think, is very important, and we talk more and more about empathy these days. Just my second question is about your background, and you've worked extensively in safeguarding and high accountability environments. From your experience, what does safeguarding reveal, or why does it reveal the true maturity of an organization far more clearly than performance matrices or dashboards or the things that we try hard to measure?
Very good question, Nancy. And as you explained, I have experience in safeguarding. Safeguarding reveals maturity because it tests behavior in situations that are complex, uncomfortable, and often reputationally sensitive. Safeguarding reveals organizational maturity because it tests behavior where complexity, ambiguity, and reputational risk are all present at the same time. And like, if I can just allude to my own experience, I was a detective superintendent with responsibility for domestic abuse, missing persons, and the management of sex offenders. And these were environments where process was necessary but never sufficient. If I can explain, the situations were often ambiguous, uncomfortable, and time critical, requiring discipline, judgment under pressure. In those moments, the determining factor was not the existence of a process, but how risk was understood, whether assumptions were challenged, and the quality of decisions made when clarity was limited. You mentioned performance metrics, but performance metrics and dashboards, while they can confirm that actions were completed, what they cannot show is whether concerns were voiced early, whether they were genuinely heard, or whether decisions prioritize the safety of an individual over organizational convenience. So, like, safeguarding exposes the reality of an organization's values, shows whether protection is actively embedded in decision making or whether it is treated as a compliance requirement. And in that sense, it moves beyond what organizations say about themselves and reveals how they actually behave when it matters most. So, in essence, safeguarding tests behavior when the situation is uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And what you've said around compliance, Jerry, is true. I think a lot of organizations still treat any new standards or new you want to put in place as compliance rather than really embedding those in the behaviors, and especially the leadership behavior. So those are things that we need maybe to look beyond and look at what really is changing in these organizations when we start looking at these new standards. So, Jenny, when we talk about governance, many organizations have strong governance structures on paper, like we're talking standards, compliance, governance, all of these reports, committees, escalation processes. But how do organizations move from governance that reports performance to governance that genuinely protects people and supports sound decision making under pressure?
Um, for me, the shift begins by redefining the purpose of governance. Many systems are designed to report upwards, to demonstrate that processes are being followed, whereas protective governance focuses instead on understanding risk and enabling timely action. It asks different questions. Who may be at risk? What are we not seeing? Where are the gaps? And what needs to happen now to reduce harm? And that shift brings governance closer to operational reality. Clarity of accountability is also critical. When responsibility is clearly understood, decisions are made earlier and with greater confidence. When it is unclear, issues tend to drift and risk accumulates. And maybe if I could give an example, Nancy, just to put some context around what I'm saying.
That would be great.
Yeah, so as you know, domestic abuse was one of the areas of responsibility, and it's an area that was very close to me when I was involved in safeguarding. So, if I give an example, a frontline officer attends a repeat domestic incident. The victim is anxious, they are There are subtle coercive control indicators present, and the officer believes the risk is escalating beyond what the current classification suggests. So I'm going to give an example for a mature and a less mature system. So in a mature system, the officer records the concerns fully, flags the case as high risk, and that assessment is accepted and acted upon quickly. The information flows straight into safeguarding systems, prompting a same-day multi-agency review, and I stress multi-agency review. Supervisors challenge and validate, not dilute, the assessment. Protective measures are put in place, monitoring victim support and coordinated intervention. And the outcome here would be the organisation responds to the actual level of risk. In contrast, in a less mature system, the officer's concerns are softened in his report, where he sees no visible injuries, no complaint made. The risk classification remains unchanged to avoid escalation or scrutiny. By the time the information reaches their supervisors or partner agencies, it reflects a reduced version of events. So the outcome here is the organisation responds to a sanitized narrative, and the risk continues to build, often until a serious incident forces recognition. So for me, performance governance proves the organisation is working as designed, whereas protective governance ensures the organisation is working as needed, especially when pressure, ambiguity, and human risk are at their highest. In policing, that distinction is not, it's not academic. It's where organisation either intervenes early and prevents harm or arrives later and explains it.
This is very
I
good.
hope that put some context into what I'm trying to say, Nancy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this ties back to, I mean, to my follow-up question on this, Jerry. You spoke about outcomes, and I think maybe there's a way to change outcomes and through accountability and clarity of accountability that ties to the example you've shared, right? And how do we preserve the reality of things? So what do you say about that?
So, me, clarity reduces hesitation. In high pressure environments, uncertainty about responsibility delays decisions and delays increase risk. It also builds confidence across the organization. People are more likely to raise concerns when they understand how those concerns will be acted upon. And that strengthens both response and trust. So for me, clarity reduces hesitation and accountability enables timely action. So when accountability is clear, decisions are quicker and more effective.
Yeah, I think that's you're absolutely right here. And Jerry, I know you've been working in high risk environments, and in such high risk environments like major international events, security operations, psychological safety is really something labeled as a soft topic, and more businesses talks about that. But from your operational experience, what does psychological safety look like in practice, and why should it be seen as a core risk control, not a cultural nice to have? Because we are still treating it many times as a nice thing to have.
It's a wonderful question, Nancy. There's a lot of discussion around psychological safety, but I do ask myself, do people fully understand what psychological safety really means? For me, it means people can raise concerns, they can challenge assumptions, and they can admit uncertainty without fear of negative consequences. And in high risk situations and environments, that is essential. If people do not feel safe to speak openly, early warning signs are missed, issues escalate, uncertainty becomes uncertain, sorry, issues escalate unnecessarily because they are not addressed early. That directly affects decision quality and operational effectiveness. And from that perspective, psychological safety it's not a cultural luxury, it's a control that protects the flow of information, which is critical for sound decision making. And I can share another example for you if you wish, maybe to support what I mean by psychological safety.
Absolutely. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear it, Jerry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's related again, but I suppose that has been my life for 33 years, Nancy. So it's in relation to if a team is progressing a serious assault, um, and the working theory is supported by early statements, and what is known about the suspect. So resources are directed towards building a case around the individual. Whereas a civilian analyst who was not a police person, but part of the police team, reviews some data. I won't go too much into tradecraft, but reviews some data and notices inconsistencies that suggest the timeline may not hold. So it raises the possibility that the suspect may not have been present at the critical time. So where psychological safety is present, the analyst will feel able to challenge the prevailing narrative, um, and be able to discuss where and will advise the senior investigation officer who has the ability then to pause, reopen the hypothesis and test alternative lines of inquiry. And then the team will adjust direction. Where psychological safety is absent, the analyst would hesitate. Case direction, while it appears clear, is going in the wrong direction. And that's because the analyst didn't feel safe. And the inconsistencies are not raised clearly or would be softened. And which would mean in the outcome is that the organization progresses in a coherent but flawed narrative, increasing the risk of error or failure in court. And it's something that was key to myself and I suppose other leaders that I worked towards was to ensure that there was candor, to ensure that there was openness, and that the silent person in the room may have the best amount of information for you and always allow for that information to flow when involved in dialogue with your team.
I think this is really, important for organizations, Jerry. Sometimes we treat silence as being neutral, but it's not necessarily that, right? It's really an important signal of a lot of issues that could be there in the organization. And your example, I think many of the listeners would connect to because we see this also when investigations happens for health and safety problems, when there's accidents or a lot of, any other workplace incident. We see people holding information silent, not talking about what really happened because they not necessarily have the trust and the courage to speak up because the culture doesn't support it. So thank you for your example, Jerry. Drawing on your crisis leadership and international advisory work, what does leadership maturity look like when decisions are time critical, ethically complex, and publicly scrutinized? We're talking here more about maybe the leadership behavior.
So leadership maturity in conditions like that, it's about calmness, clarity, and consistency of judgment. It's not about having perfect information, but about creating enough stability for others to function effectively. For me, mature leaders remain open to challenge even under time pressure. They don't simply or simplify ethical complexity simply to move faster. They recognize that urgency does not remove responsibility. Um, they also understand that their behavior signals what matters. And in pressured environments, people observe not just decisions, but how those decisions are made. And that shapes organizational behavior. Um, Mature leaders create clarity around using judgments, and urgency does not remove their ethical responsibilities. For me, mature leaders stay calm, remain open to challenge, and act with clarity without compromising judgment.
I think I like the way you're putting this, and this makes me think about organizations too, right? So if leaders in organization have this kind of behavior, organizations will necessarily, maybe will have better capabilities to learn from crisis, right? And have you noticed like anything unique about organizations that truly learn from crisis from those that simply recover and carry on? What are those
Yeah,
traits that are different?
yeah, Nancy. Yes, Nancy. Learning from pressure is key. Sometimes organizations just recover rather than actually learn. The key difference is whether the organization is willing to examine itself honestly. Recovery restores function, but learning requires full reflection. Organizations that learn ask what the crisis revealed about leadership, communication, culture, and decision making, and they are prepared to hear uncomfortable answers. Importantly, they translate that insight into structural change, adjusting how decisions are made, how information flows, and how accountability is defined. And I can relate to another scenario just to explain, Nancy, and I'll speak about domestic abuse again. As I said, it's key to me. Um, so if an organization is attending the same address for domestic incidents over a number of months, and each call is dealt with appropriately in isolation, but no one fully connects the pattern, and the case later escalates into serious harm. Organizations that learn here will review and ask different questions. Um, why, like the question, like why did the recording incidents not make sense to us at that time? And they'll find that each incident was assessed in isolation. Information existed but was not connected or evaluated. And supervisory oversight focused on completion, not interpretation. And the actions taken should be that they redesign their systems so repeat incidents are automatically escalated. Whereas in organizations just want to recover, they don't focus on the lessons learned, and they just try to deal with the incident itself rather than how will the response to these incidents improve the response in the future. And I think that's what lessons learned is all about. It's about focusing on how will we improve rather than how will we just deal with what's in front of us at the current time.
Very interesting, Jared. I think learning from the issues that's happening, learning from crisis, learning from mistakes is very important. I think the culture of organization should really reinforce that. And I think, yeah, lessons learned are key in many disciplines, and we're not necessarily leveraging that. So I like that, and I would tie it directly to excellence and how do we really build systems that help the organization move forward and keep improving. And Jared,
And
now, yep.
if I can, Nancy, and I just like there's a correlation between lessons learned and psychological safety. And through lessons you learn is when those that work in an organization feel psychologically safe to come out and express themselves and tell everything that happened. And that's when true lessons are learned. So if there's psychological safety within an organization and an organization introduces, I would say, as functional lessons learned frameworks, they will become very mature.
Yeah, and you're mentioning functional. We have so many systems that not necessarily functional in an organization. I think that's really the key is design something that works and gonna give you the right outcome. So thank you for highlighting this for our listeners, Jared. And as we come close to the end of today's episode, I just have one last question for you. And if leaders are listening today, can you give one insight that they really need to focus on about excellence under pressure, something that requires honest reflection from their side? What would you suggest to them?
Um, I would encourage leaders to reflect on what their organization becomes under pressure, because pressure doesn't create behavior, it reveals it. So the real question is whether when pressure rises, people feel able to speak openly, leaders remain receptive to reality, and decisions continue to prioritize what matters most. And that is where true maturity of an organization is found. So pressure will reveal the organization you truly have. And excellence is defined by the behavior under pressure. And I think pressure reveals your real culture and leadership. And this is where maturity is really measured.
Absolutely. I love what you said, Jerry. And I think you've said also receptive leaders. Leaders are not necessarily sometimes receptive to understand or to acknowledge the reality of their organization and their culture. And I think under pressure, the pressure really shows organization what they are made of and what leaders are made of. I like this angle a lot. Thank you very much, Jared, for this insightful discussion. And this conversation reminds me that excellence isn't demonstrated by how organizations perform when things are predictable, right? But by how they protect their people, they make sense of the risk around them, and they act with integrity when the stakes are real. So thank you for all your examples, Gerard. Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up?
No, Nancy, it was a pleasure talking to you today. And I suppose I reflect back on your last statement, and it's responsive leadership and receptive leadership, and be open to what's being said to you and what is happening within your environment.
Excellent. I think in many episodes we've highlighted self-awareness, right? Leaders need to understand also their style, need to understand their I would say their areas that they need to improve, but also be receptive to everything happening around them. So for those listening, I'll leave you with this reflection. Don't ask your organization if it's mature. Ask it who it becomes when the pressure is on. Ask whose voices disappear, where decisions slow down or rush, and what ethical lines suddenly become negotiable. That's where your real system lives. Thank you for listening to the Excellence Foresight. If this episode resonated, share it, reflect on it, and most importantly, talk about it inside your organization. Until next time, Gerard Murphy, thank you again.
Thank you, Nancy.